Hello. Hi, guys. Just so you know, I'm gonna be doing some of these screencastify, so you could be able to get some of the lecture instead of me talking to class, and that way we can probably get ahead on the topics and make sure we cover everything. So anyway, as I mentioned last week, I'm gonna be covering Island Biogeography, which is a 2.3, and hopefully I can get or we can get the next of the unit 2 done by this week and have a test on Friday. So let's start talking about island biogeography by linking it to the previous topic that we've been covering. So let's start. Okay, species richness, remember? So species richness, as we talked last week, is influenced by many factors, as we covered last time, and we're going to use some of these factors to continue talking about species richness or biodiversity. So one of the ways that we do this is using this theory that's called the theory of island biogeography, and this theory is based on the study of islands and the behavior of species migrating into this island. So we're going to look at two main factors when we talked about this theory. One of them is the size of the island, and the other is going to be the distance from the mainland. Okay, so let's look at them. One example, it was the study of these small islands in Lake Valens in Hungary, and they study how the number of the bird species change as the size of the island increase. So there's going to be more species diversity as the size of the island increases. So the larger the island, the more number of species present. Okay, so what is island biogeography? Island biogeography is used to determine the number of species on an island, and that is affected by the rate of immigration of species and the rate of extinction. At this point, I just want to clarify that when I talked about extinction is only referring to the extinction of that species on the island. So that is called extirpation. I think I mentioned it last week, but just in case, extirpation is the extinction in the local place. Okay, so that would be one factor that affects the number of species. Okay, so the island species richness is determined again by the size of the island and the distance from the mainland. And we're going to talk about three factors that have this effect of species richness. So let's look at the first factor, distance effect. So the distance effect tells me that there is more chance that I have more species migrating to an island that's closer to the mainland compared to an island that's farther away. It's very easy. The second one is the target size. So if I have a species flying over the ocean, I have a better chance of a species moving or migrating into a larger island compared to a smaller island, just because they might just miss the small island and just tend to migrate towards a larger land space. And the last one is the differential extinction. So this principle tells me that larger islands tend to have lower extinction rates because of the proportion of animals present on the island. So if I have a certain number of species in this picture, it might seem like the larger island and the smaller island have the same extinction rate, but because their population proportion, this would represent a lower extinction rate. Okay, so this island biogeography, we need to know also that most of the species living in the island are going to be specialists. And the reason why this is happening is because the limited resources that the island can offer. So if the island only has specific resources, because islands do, right, most species are going to become a specialist species. But that is kind of a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, because if for some reason we have some invasive species coming into the island, because they travel, I don't know, in feces of animals or in seeds of visitors, seeds of shoes of visitors, they're usually generalist species, and they might take over these specialist species, and they outcompete the specialists, and they might drive them to extinction. So that's a problem. Okay, let's look at this graph and analyze how these factors affect the number of species. So on an island, we're going to have that there are species arriving into the island. So there is going to be a high immigration rate, right? On the island will provide a higher number of species. Now, there is also the higher extinction rate um, for an island, depending on the size of the island. We're going to look at this in detail on the next slide, but these are the two factors, okay? So we might have that the rate of arrival of this species on an island is going to drop as a species accumulate. That means that usually if a species arrive on an island, that species is gonna be possibly already on the island. So even though that species has migrated into the island, the chances are that that species is already there. So it wouldn't be a new species. Okay. Now the extinction rate is gonna increase as individuals from different species compete for the resources. So if we have more species arriving, right? If we have more number of species, probably one of those species will drive the other one to extinction because of competition for resources. And also, we need to mention that the equilibrium point, which determines the number of species, is when the immigration rate equals the extinction rate. Feel free to pause the video at any point to understand and take notes on these concepts. That would help you. Okay, so don't forget, there's an equilibrium rate, which is determined by, or it represents the number of species on an island, and that happens when the immigration rate equals the extinction rate. Okay, so let's look at the effect of the size of the island. So we said that immigration usually is higher on larger islands, and this is just because if you are a bird again flying over the ocean, you might miss the smaller islands. Therefore, there is a better chance or a higher chance that you will end up in a larger island. So they might have a higher immigration rate, but also there is a lower extinction rate on the island because of the capability of larger islands to support a higher number of species, right? So there is a lower extinction rate compared to a smaller island. So that's the effect of the island size. The other effect or the other factor is the distance from the mainland. So if an island is near the mainland, it's going to have a higher immigration rate. Again, this represents immigration rate. So the near or the closer to the mainland, there is a higher immigration rate because it's just close by than islands that are farther from the mainland. And again, the extinction rates don't change. So the larger the island, the lower the extinction rate compared to the island that's smaller. Okay, now let's analyze an example over here. Okay, for the number of species for the islands in the Caribbean, they studied and they saw that this is correct. The larger the islands, right? The larger or the bigger the islands, the higher the number of species on those islands. So as you can see, this is true for real islands. Okay, now why do I care about island biogeography? Well, two things. First of all, because we discovered that larger islands are going to have more equilibrium, right? More stability compared to smaller islands just because they can provide more resources and a better or more appropriate habitat for species. This is called an area effect. And the other reason why we want to study about island biogeography is because we can apply the principles of island biogeography for something that we say are fragmented areas. Now, fragmented areas are areas that have been created because of urbanization or any type of development from humans. Okay, so there is an example here, but we're going to look at how these fragmented areas form and what are the effects on biodiversity. That's why we care about island biogeography. Okay, so habitat fragmentation, as I mentioned, happens because of any kind of urbanization of development, like we can observe in this picture. And when we do that, we are splitting populations, sometimes of the same species, but we might be able to help that this fragmentation has less impact on biodiversity by creating solutions. This is called a corridor, and I'm going to talk in detail what a corridor is. But what we try to do is we want to avoid this from happening, right? Because we want to make sure that populations continue being connected in a proper way and continue having the same biodiversity on that area. Okay, so let's say we've have development on an area, and we have split an area into 4 different populations. When we create corridors, we allow for those species to continue being connected. Let me show you this with an example. Okay, we have these little cute birds. They are called the nuthatches. And these nuthatches, what they do is they can actually migrate, or they can move between areas where the populations are as individuals. It doesn't mean that all of the nuthatches from this population can migrate into the other area. That's not the point of having corridors. The point is that I might have some of these individuals moving from one area to the next through the corridors, thus allowing the gene population or the gene diversity to continue moving around. Okay, so for example, these nuthatches, they are going to use the groves of trees to live, like a habitat or whatever. So they are able to move individually. They don't have to be moving in groups. So that helps a lot if we provide corridors for them to be connected with other populations. So what would be a metapopulation? A metapopulation is a group of species, right? Or a group of individuals of a species that are migrating from one area to the next. Okay, so this population doesn't represent the overall population on an area. So if I have n number of individuals, that doesn't mean that all of those individuals are moving through the corridor. But just a specific group might move to the next area. And in this area, that doesn't mean that these same individuals are moving to the next area, but it might be a different set of individuals that are moving to the next area, and so on. So that's a metapopulation. Now, there are, of course, some things in place, some organizations that are taking care of how we impact biodiversity. The only one you need to know over here is, I'm going to call it CITES, okay? It might be CITES or whatever. But this is an organization that was founded by the IUCN. They met in 1963, and finally in 1973, they were able to establish this organization. And this is the only organization you need to know in terms of biodiversity from this lecture. Okay, I'm going to give you a copy of all the different organizations you need to know and all the different acts as well. So anyway, the purpose of creating this organization is that this organization is in charge of overlooking the fairness when doing international trading of specimens. So that would protect, hopefully, the amount of population and hopefully look for their survival. So they are not in danger, they are not threatened because of the number of individuals being part of the trade. Now, is that perfect? No, because most of the trading occurs illegally. So that is a problem. Of course, that is hard to track by this organization. But anyway, there is an organization in place for this. Okay, so also the reason why we study Island Biogeography is because it helps us to determine which areas we need to protect. Now, in order to protect an area, we need to study how that area is better adapted for the purpose of protecting a specific species. So if we look at shapes here, we're going to have the different amounts of different shapes and different ways of connecting those areas are important. So they need to study how do we decide which area to protect. For example, we're going to prefer a larger area compared to a smaller area, or one larger better than a bunch of smaller areas as well. Or if they are closer to each other, is better because the corridors are easier to be built. Or if they are clumped together instead of separated or far away from each other. What do you think this one is? If they have corridors, right, instead of no corridors, and we're always going to prefer the round shape instead of the flat shape, because this flat shape is going to make the area to have something that's called the edge effect, which I'm going to explain. Okay, so again, there is criteria for designing an area. Usually an area has to be rounded, has to be bigger. And how do they determine that that's the best way? Because they have these indicator species. When we talked about indicator species in the past, we mentioned keystone species, and we mentioned examples of these keystone species like you guys presented. So one of these indicators, just an extra one, it's amphibians. Amphibians, like frogs, are a good indicator. They are good indicator species that population is healthy on that specific area. Okay, so that's one way. Now, edge effects. Edge effects are a problem, okay? Because what we do is when we fragment an area, we're pushing populations of different species to the middle of that area. And that is not necessarily healthy for those populations. So there are different reasons why there are edge effects. One of them is that on the edges, we're going to have a lot of variation for the abiotic factors, like stronger winds or like invasive species being located on these edges and overtaking those spaces for the populations that should be using this space properly. Okay, so that's not good. Also, we talked about how the shape is important, and circular reduces these edge effects. That's why we prefer circular reserves. We also talked about the importance of corridors and how that is one possible solution because it allows movement of organisms and that increases or maintains the gene flow of organisms. So that's good. But corridors aren't perfect because what they're going to do is they might reduce the populations too much in one area. That means that instead of having those meta populations moving between areas, what is going to happen is they might have the whole population being transferred through the corridor from one area to the other one, and that's a problem. It could also allow the spread of diseases or invasive species. It could also let poachers move, which is not the point, but it could happen, right? So that is a problem. So it's not a perfect solution. So they shouldn't include on these reserves or in these protected areas, they should include buffer zones. And if you remember anything from chemistry, a buffer is something that's going to help withstand a big change. So buffer zones should be areas in between the reserve area and the urbanized area. So for example, that doesn't happen though, right? But it should happen because it's not okay to have an urban area next to a reserve area. That's not going to be a good idea for the population. It does happen. And like one of these examples is here in this picture. Okay, so how do I know that this protected area is successful? If I have that area run by the government, that's a good thing. Okay, the government has to fund it, otherwise it's not going to work. Mainly, okay, it's going to take more work. Now, that area probably has to be a touristy destination because the attraction or the visitors will also help with the funding, but it can also have a negative impact as we studied on tourism. Now, usually it should run by some kind of management program that will monitor the populations on that area, but also we have some of those protected areas that not necessarily have any human involvement and they are still working successfully. And another thing is that those areas should have high profile species because that's what attracts tourism, right? So high profile species would be like Bengal tigers or giant pandas or orangutans, something that calls the attention from people because people don't really want to create design or protected areas for organisms like ants or capybaras or whatever. They want something, that is going to be a large animal usually or a top predator sometimes. Okay, so every time that you want to make something a protected area, you should take those factors into account and ask these questions over here, right? If the species that you are studying is in danger, if you have high profile species, what is the shape of that area? Has it been a way to protect that population in a different country or a different continent? Can I apply the same principles here on that specific space? So anyway, this is what I have for Island Biogeography, and I hope to see you in class. So that's all for me.